Everyone at Mercer Industries knew the rule. Not because it was posted in the employee handbook, not because it was recited during orientation, but because they had all watched it happen at least once. A senior project coordinator, gone. A department head with 11 years of tenure, escorted out by security before lunch. The rule was simple, brutal, and enforced without exception. Arrive late. Lose your job. No discussion. No second chance. No appeal. And the person behind that rule was the same person who had turned a mid-sized manufacturing firm into one of the most efficient operations in the Pacific Northwest. Victoria Hayes, Chief Executive Officer, 41 years old, and entirely unbothered by anyone's opinion of her methods. That Thursday morning in February, when the sky turned white before 7 a.m. and the roads iced over in sheets overnight, 22 employees called in to report they were running behind. Victoria read the messages over black coffee and felt nothing except mild irritation. And then the clock in the lobby read 8:10, and a man she had never spoken to directly walked through the front doors with snow still melting on his shoulders, and by 8:25, his career at Mercer Industries was over. Victoria Hayes had not always been this way, though she would have been the last person to admit that something had changed. Somewhere between her first management role at 26 and the boardroom at 38, she had decided that efficiency was a form of respect, that running a tight ship was the kindest thing a leader could do for the people who depended on her decisions. She had watched too many soft-hearted managers play favorites, bend rules for the wrong people, and watch their departments crumble from the inside. She had vowed she would never be that. When she took over as CEO, she cut the payroll by 14% in the first quarter and increased output by 19% in the second. The board loved her. Investors loved her. Clients loved her. The employees who remained the ones who survived what everyone privately called the culling learned to live inside her system like fish who had adapted to cold water. They were efficient, punctual, and they did not complain where anyone could hear them. Victoria walked through those halls and saw discipline. She did not see fear. She had convinced herself the two looked the same. The morning Ethan Carter arrived, 10 minutes late, was a morning that had been conspiring against punctuality since before dawn. A jackknife delivery truck on Route 47 had collapsed traffic into a single lane that stretched back nearly 2 miles. The storm had started overnight, and by 6 a.m., it had buried the roads in 5 inches of new snow that the city's salt trucks hadn't yet reached. 3 separate fender benders had been reported between the industrial district and the highway interchange. Most Mercer employees had left their homes 40 minutes early. Some had left an hour early. Ethan Carter had left an hour and 20 minutes early, because Ethan Carter had a 7-year-old daughter named Lily, who needed to be dropped at her grandmother's house. First his mother, who watched Lily on the mornings Ethan's shift at the school didn't cover, because Ethan had been raising Lily alone for 4 years, since the accident that had taken his wife Rachel on a rain-slicked overpass that looked, he had always thought, a lot like the roads looked that morning. He dropped Lily off. He drove into gridlock. He parked his truck on the shoulder of Meridian Street when traffic stopped moving entirely, and he ran the last 6 blocks to the Mercer building with his laptop bag over his shoulder and his coat open because he hadn't had time to button it, and when he pushed through the glass doors, his breath was coming in clouds, and the lobby clock read 8:10. Ethan was 36 years old and had worked in the engineering division at Mercer for 7 years. He was the kind of employee that managers in other departments tried to poach: methodical, collaborative, the person who stayed late, not because he was trying to impress anyone, but because he genuinely didn't like leaving problems half-solved. His colleagues brought him their questions, the way people bring broken things to someone they trust, to understand how the pieces fit together. He had won the Internal Technical Excellence Award twice. He had never been written up. He had never, in 7 years, been late to work by more than 2 minutes, and that had been the morning after Lily's ear infection kept both of them up until 3 a.m. He took a breath in the lobby, straightened his jacket, and was walking toward the elevator when Jennifer from the front desk caught his eye with an expression that told him everything. The call came from Victoria's assistant, while he was still in the hallway. 3rd floor. Now, he rode the elevator with the particular stillness of a man who understands that something significant is about to happen, and has decided, in advance, to meet it with dignity. The third-floor conference room had floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the city. On clear days, you could see the mountain range to the east, white-capped and permanent. That morning there was nothing but gray sky and the soft violence of falling snow. Victoria was already seated when Ethan walked in. She looked at him across the table with the flat, impersonal focus of someone doing an administrative task, not unkind, exactly, but entirely without warmth. He explained calmly. The truck on 47, the gridlock, the 6 blocks he had run through ankle, deep snow. He was not pleading. He stated the facts, the way an engineer states facts, clearly and in sequence. Victoria listened to approximately 40 seconds of this before she raised one hand and stopped him. "Mr. Carter," she said, "I'm not here to evaluate the merits of your mourning. The policy exists because exceptions undermine the entire structure." Ethan looked at her for a long moment. "I understand the policy," he said. "I'm asking you to understand the person." Victoria stood and told him that HR would process his paperwork by end of day. She thanked him for his years of service in a tone that suggested she was thanking him for holding a door. She walked out, and Ethan stood alone in a room full of white sky and falling snow. And he was, by any reasonable measure, too stunned to move. He went back to his desk. He packed his things with the careful, deliberate movements of someone who refuses to give an audience anything to look at. His colleague Marcus stood nearby, useless with grief and fury on his behalf, not saying anything because there was nothing to say that wouldn't make it worse. 2 other engineers hovered near the doorway. Somebody had brought Ethan a cup of coffee, which he didn't drink, but he held it anyway because it gave his hands something to do. The floor had gone quiet in that particular way that happens when something wrong occurs in a shared space, people lowering their voices, making themselves smaller, as if noise might attract the same fate. Ethan picked up the framed photo of Lily from the corner of his desk. He tucked it under his arm. Then he said, "To nobody in particular, and to everyone at once. Something that would stay in that room long after he left it. I hope she never finds herself somewhere that she needs someone's mercy. I hope, for her sake, she never knows what it feels like to be at someone else's discretion." He said it without bitterness. That was the most unsettling part, how completely absent the anger was. He walked to the elevator, pressed the button, and was gone. The snow kept falling outside the windows. Marcus stood by Ethan's empty desk for a long time before he went back to work. Victoria, on the 3rd floor, felt none of it. She returned to her desk and spent 40 minutes on a conference call about a supply chain restructuring she had been negotiating for 6 weeks. She ate lunch at her desk, a salad, no dressing, and approved 3 hiring requisitions. By 2 p.m., she had moved through the morning completely, the way she moved through everything efficiently, forward, without looking back. She had a standing dinner appointment with her business partner at the Ridgeline Resort. A 3.5-hour drive into the mountains, and she had planned to leave by 3 to get ahead of the afternoon rush. Her assistant, David, had suggested twice that she take the company car with a driver. The mountain roads were deteriorating, he said. The forecast was calling for another 6 inches by nightfall. Victoria told him she had been driving mountain roads since she was 19 and she was perfectly capable of handling winter conditions. She signed the last document on her desk, closed her laptop, pulled on her gray wool coat, and walked to the parking garage. The temperature outside had dropped 4 degrees since morning. She did not notice. The drive started well enough. The highway was plowed and salted, and Victoria's black SUV European, 18 months old, and full of sensors and safety systems, handled the wet roads with the confidence of something over-engineered for this purpose. She had the heat at 68 degrees and a business podcast playing through the speakers, a conversation between 2 venture capitalists about vertical integration that she found moderately interesting. She passed through the last major interchange and began the climb into the foothills, and the character of the road changed. The plows hadn't made it this far yet. The snow was smooth and unbroken across both lanes, interrupted only by the occasional tire track from a vehicle that had come through hours before. The trees on either side were enormous old-growth fir and pine, their branches loaded with white, the light fading early as the clouds pressed lower. Victoria turned off the podcast and drove in silence, reading the road, keeping a steady pace. She was maybe 40 minutes from the resort, maybe 45. The sky to the west had turned from gray to something darker, closer to the color of old pewter, and the snow was falling again. Finer now, almost like dust. It started with a sound she didn't recognize, a soft, rhythmic knocking from somewhere beneath the hood, like something tapping politely but insistently from the inside. She glanced at the dashboard. A warning light came on that she had never seen before, an orange symbol she couldn't immediately identify. She slowed down. The knocking continued. Then a second warning light appeared, this one red, and simultaneously the heater fan stopped, and the music cut out, and every indicator on the dashboard illuminated at once in a brief, terrible concert of yellow and orange and red before the entire panel went dark. The engine did not sputter or gasp or give any dramatic announcement. It simply stopped. The SUV rolled forward for 30 feet on its own momentum, slowing. And then it stopped too, in the middle of the road, surrounded by trees, in the snow, in the growing dark. Victoria sat very still for a moment. Then she tried to restart the engine. Nothing. She tried again. The ignition made a small, pathetic click, and then silence. She tried 4 more times. She sat back in her seat. She picked up her phone. No signal. She already knew, somewhere in the back of her mind, that she had driven through the last reliable coverage about 12 miles back. She tried anyway, moving the phone to different corners of the car, holding it up toward the windshield. One bar appeared, and then vanished. She tried to send a text to David. It sat in her outbox, unsent. She tried to call 911, nothing. She turned on the hazard lights, which at least confirmed that some vestige of the electrical system was still functioning. Then she sat with her hands in her lap and thought, with a clarity that she rarely brought to anything personal, about her actual situation. Disabled vehicle. No communication. No passing traffic. Temperature outside, somewhere in the mid-20s and falling. Daylight maybe 40 minutes from gone. Dressed for a dinner meeting, and not for a night in the mountains. She had no blanket in the car. She had half a bottle of water. She had a dead phone and a laptop and a gray wool coat that was beautiful and expensive and designed for a city winter, not this. For the first time in a very long time, possibly for the first time since she had been a young woman with no power over anything, Victoria Hayes felt genuinely afraid. Not anxious, not strategically concerned. Afraid, the kind of afraid that moves into your chest and stays there. 15 minutes passed. No headlights appeared on the road in either direction. The snow was covering the hood of the SUV in a thin, even layer. 20 minutes. Victoria had gotten out of the car briefly to look down the road and had come back inside almost immediately because the cold was nothing like what she had expected. It entered through her coat, through her thin dress shirt, and sat against her skin like something hostile. 30 minutes. She had run through the options methodically, the way she ran through everything, and kept arriving at the same answer. There were no good options. She could walk, but to where? And in what direction? And in these shoes? On this road, in this cold? She could wait, but wait for what? For how long? For a vehicle that might not come before the temperature dropped another 10 degrees. She began, in the silence of the car, to think about Lily, not about anyone connected to her by name, but about the small, abstract fact of a child who would be going to bed tonight, expecting her father to come home, and who would not understand what absence meant yet, not fully, and who had already learned it once in the worst possible way. She thought of Ethan Carter, who dropped that child at her grandmother's house in a snowstorm this morning and ran 6 blocks to get to work on time. She did not let herself finish the thought. The headlights appeared in her rearview mirror like something out of a dream, 2 amber points in the dark, moving slowly, carefully, the cautious approach of a vehicle being driven by someone who understood these roads. She was out of the car before the truck had fully stopped. Standing in the snow, one hand up. The vehicle that pulled over was a dark green pickup truck, older model, the kind that had seen 100 winters and wasn't bothered by this one. The engine idled. The door opened. A man stepped out, pulling on a work jacket over a flannel shirt, and he looked up through the snow at her. And she looked at him, and the recognition hit both of them at exactly the same moment, landing in the space between them like something dropped from a great height. Ethan Carter stood 10 feet away from Victoria Hayes in the dark. On a mountain road, in a snowstorm, 7 hours after she had taken his job. He looked at her. She looked at him. Neither of them moved for a long moment. Victoria's mind went entirely silent in the way that minds sometimes do when reality presents itself in a configuration too improbable to process quickly. She thought, clearly and without elaboration. He is going to get back in his truck and drive away. And she thought, I deserve that. Ethan did not get back in his truck. He stood there for a moment, and whatever passed across his face in those seconds, and something did pass across it, she could see that clearly resolved into something that looked like decision. Not forgiveness, not warmth, not yet. Decision. He walked toward her car, glanced at the hazard lights, still blinking orange in the snow, and said, What happened? His voice was even, professional, almost. Victoria told him, warning lights, engine failure, no communication. He nodded once, went to the front of the SUV, and gestured for her to pull the hood release. He looked at the engine with a flashlight from his jacket pocket, the beam moving carefully across components she couldn't name. He didn't say anything for a minute and a half. Then he said, It's not something I can fix out here. You've got an electrical failure, looks like the main relay, possibly tied to the battery management system. It needs a shop. He looked up at her. There's a truck stop and a rest station about 4 miles north. They have a landline and a mechanic on call. He said it simply, without affect, the way someone delivers information when they've decided that their personal feelings about the recipient are not relevant to the moment. Victoria nodded. She did not say thank you yet because she was not sure she had earned the right to. She locked the SUV and climbed into the passenger seat of his truck, and the warmth inside hit her like something physical. He had the heat turned all the way up. And there was a travel mug of coffee in the console, and a child's drawing clipped to the sun visor that she noticed immediately and looked away from. The truck smelled like pine sap and motor oil and something warm she couldn't identify, and the cab was clean in the way that spaces are clean when someone takes care of things not out of habit but out of respect for what they have. Ethan pulled back onto the road. He drove carefully, unhurried, both hands on the wheel. The silence lasted maybe 2 minutes before Victoria spoke. Because Victoria Hayes had never been good at silence. Silence meant inefficiency, and inefficiency made her uncomfortable. She said, I assume you understand how strange this is. He said, Yes. She said, You didn't have to stop. He was quiet for a moment, watching the road. No, he said. I didn't. She waited for more. He didn't give it. The wipers moved across the windshield in their steady rhythm. And outside, the trees stood immense and dark on both sides. And the snow came down in the headlights like static. Like noise. Like the visual equivalent of everything that was unresolved between them. He talked while he drove, eventually, because the drive was long enough and the silence between two people in a small, warm space in the middle of a dark winter road has a weight that eventually has to be addressed. He did not talk about the morning. He talked about the road, about the conditions, about the fact that this stretch of mountain highway was notorious in winter for exactly this kind of cascade failure in modern vehicles. The onboard systems couldn't handle the combination of extreme cold and road vibration, did unpredictable things to the electrical architecture. He had driven this road for years, he said, in trucks that had no computers in them, trucks that understood cold and didn't try to overthink it. Victoria listened in a way she was not accustomed to listening, without preparing her response, without waiting for the point, just receiving. She asked him how he knew the road this well. He said he had a cousin who ran a logging operation about 20 miles north. And he came out this way sometimes on weekends, in better weather, and brought his daughter. Victoria looked at the drawing on the visor. A house, a stick figure in yellow crayon, what appeared to be a large dog. How old is she? She asked. 7, he said. 8 in April. Victoria looked out at the snow. He told her, without her asking, about the morning. Not as accusation, more the way someone fills in a record, setting down the facts for completeness. He had left the house at 6:40, he said. The backup route to the highway had been blocked by a plow that had stalled on the on-ramp. He had called the main Mercer line at 8:03 to let them know he was running behind. He had run 6 blocks in dress shoes. Victoria had not known about the call to the main line because nobody had told her. She sat with that. She thought about the 40 seconds she had allowed him to speak before she stopped him. And she thought about the way she had walked out of the room, and she thought about the enormous and ordinary fact that his child had needed to be dropped somewhere safe before he could come to work, and that this was the same child whose drawing was clipped to the sun visor of the truck he had been driving on a mountain road on his own time, on a day she had made significantly worse for him, and that he had nonetheless stopped when he saw her lights in the snow. She could not make it add up in any framework she recognized. She had no category for it. The policies she governed by had no column for this kind of accounting. The rest station appeared in the headlights, a low wooden building with a lit sign, and 2 fuel pumps, and a single window glowing orange from inside. Ethan pulled into the lot and cut the engine. A man named George came to the door before they were even out of the truck. A broad-shouldered man in his 60s, in a Carhartt vest, who looked at Ethan and said his name the way people say the names of people they are genuinely happy to see. Ethan Carter. You still driving that old beast? He looked at Victoria with polite curiosity. Ethan explained the situation, the stranded SUV, the location, the suspected relay failure. George already had his phone out. Mike's on call tonight. He can be up there in an hour, he said, and then he held the door open and said, "Come inside. It's 22 degrees, and that was the entirety of the formality. Inside there was a wood stove and a pot of coffee on a burner, and an old retriever named Biscuit, who lifted his head from his spot near the fire and then put it back down, satisfied that no emergency was underway. George's wife, a small woman named Ruth, who had apparently been asleep in the back, appeared in a flannel robe and immediately offered food, and when Ethan tried to decline, she spoke to him in the tone of someone who had won this argument many times before. Victoria sat in a wooden chair near the stove and let her hands thaw and watched all of it. She watched the way George asked Ethan about his daughter by name. She watched the way Ethan answered with a smile that was different from any expression she had seen on a Mercer employee in years. Unguarded and real, the kind of smile that belongs to a person in a context where they feel known. She watched Ruth bring a plate of food and rest her hand briefly on Ethan's shoulder, the way an older person touches someone they've been rooting for. And she heard Ruth say quietly, "You're always out here taking care of somebody." And she heard Ethan laugh and say something back that she couldn't quite catch. But the tone of it was warmth meeting warmth. Victoria looked at the fire for a long time. She thought about the conference call she had been on at 2 p.m., while Ethan was packing his personal belongings into a box. She thought about the word structure and how she had used it in that room this morning, as if it were a thing more important than a person. She thought about the fact that she had built a company full of people who were afraid of her, and that she had interpreted their fear as respect, and that she had believed the interpretation so completely and for so long that she had never once questioned it until this moment, sitting in the orange firelight of a rest stop she'd never heard of. Warm because of the decency of a man she had discarded. She didn't speak to Ethan directly for a while. She called David from George's landline and told him where she was and that the SUV would need to be towed. She called her dinner partner and rescheduled. She sat with her coffee and with her own thoughts, which were not comfortable company. She was not a woman who cried she had trained that reflex out of herself years ago, believing it was a vulnerability she couldn't afford, but she sat with something that felt adjacent to it, a pressure in the chest that had no efficient outlet. At some point, Ethan came and sat in the chair across from her, not close, just nearby, the way someone sits when they're not trying to crowd you but also not pretending the situation isn't what it is. Victoria looked at him and said, with more directness than she had intended, "Why did you stop?" He considered the question seriously, as if he owed it a genuine answer. "Because you were in trouble," he said. "That's the whole reason." She shook her head slowly. "After what I did this morning." "What you did this morning was wrong," he said, and his voice was even and quiet, and completely without drama. "But that doesn't change what the situation was tonight. You were in trouble. The road was dark. The temperature was going to keep dropping. He picked up his coffee. I couldn't unknow that. She slept for a few hours in the back room that Ruth offered her, on a narrow bed with a quilt over her that smelled like cedar and old laundry. And she lay there in the dark and thought about the 17 years she had spent converting herself into something impenetrable. She thought about the first time she had been passed over for a promotion she deserved, at 27, and how she had decided that morning that the world responded to strength, and that she was going to be the strongest thing in every room she entered. She thought about the people she had let go over the years, the faces she had forgotten, the explanations she hadn't listened to. She thought about a 7-year-old girl named Lily, who was sleeping somewhere tonight expecting her father to come home in the morning, and about the fact that Lily's father was in a rest stop common room because he had stopped to help the person who had fired him. She did not come to any grand conclusions in the dark. She simply let herself know what she knew. That she had been wrong. And that being wrong had a cost. And that someone else had been paying it. She thought about how easily she had reached for policy as a shield. How convenient it was to say that rules were the reason, so that she never had to examine whether the rules themselves were right. She thought about the look on Ethan's face in the conference room. Not anger, not even hurt, exactly, but something more searching and more difficult, the expression of someone trying to understand what they are looking at. She had met it with the door. She had walked out because walking out was what you did when you had the power. And she had always had the power, and she had never once asked herself what that cost the person on the other side of the door. She lay under Ruth's cedar-smelling quilt and let the question sit in the dark beside her, unanswered and unhurried, the way uncomfortable truths sometimes have to sit before they become the basis of something better. In the morning, the sky was clear and impossibly blue. The kind of sky that only appears after a major storm, when the air has been scrubbed clean and the light comes back brighter than before. The tow truck had retrieved her SUV overnight, and the mechanic, Mike, confirmed the relay failure and estimated a repair time of 4 hours. Ethan had slept in his truck. Apparently he said it as a plain fact, with no bid for sympathy, when George mentioned it over coffee. Victoria had not known he was still there. She had assumed he would have driven home once she was safely inside. She stood in the small kitchen with this information and let it settle over her. He had not left. He had stayed nearby, in a truck cab in a parking lot in 20-degree cold, on a night that was already far more complicated than it needed to be for him, because he was the kind of person who stayed nearby until he was sure the problem was resolved. She drank her coffee and did not say anything for a long moment. Ethan was in the parking lot when she came outside, loading something into his truck, about to leave. She called his name. He turned. She walked toward him across the snow-cleared lot in the cold morning light, and she stopped a few feet away from him, and she looked at him for a moment without speaking. Then she said, "I was wrong. Yesterday morning, I was wrong about the policy. I was wrong about the way I applied it, and I was wrong about not listening to you." She paused. "I've been wrong about a lot of things for a long time. And I've been telling myself that being wrong was actually just being rigorous. Which is a very convenient story." Ethan watched her. He did not jump in or fill the silence. She continued, "I'd like to offer you your position back, with a promotion and a salary adjustment that reflects what you've actually been worth to that company for the past 7 years, and I understand completely if you need time, or if the answer is no." Ethan looked at her for a long moment, his hands in his jacket pockets. The cold morning behind him, all blue and white and clean. "Let me think about it," he said, and she nodded. Because that was a fair answer, and because she had no right to expect anything faster than that. The drive back to the city took 2 hours, in the rental car that David had arranged to be delivered to the rest stop by 9 a.m. Victoria drove the plowed highway and thought about everything she needed to undo. And not just for Ethan. She thought about the coordinator she had let go 18 months ago, who had twins in the NICU, when she was late 3 times in the same month. She thought about the project manager who had asked for 2 hours of flexibility on Fridays to pick up his daughter from physical therapy, and she had said no because the request felt like a precedent she didn't want to set. She thought about a young analyst named Brandon who had asked her, in a department meeting about benefits, whether the company had any provisions for parental flexibility beyond the legal minimum, And she had looked at him with an expression that made people understand they had asked the wrong question in the wrong room. And he had nodded, and sat down, and not asked again, and had resigned 4 months later for a company 2 blocks away with a different answer. She had filed his departure under low retention risk, and had not thought about it again until now. She thought about all the human things she had reclassified as administrative problems, sorted and disposed of like items on a workflow chart, and she thought about how long that list actually was once she started looking, and how efficiently she had trained herself not to look. She arrived at the Mercer building at 11:30, walked past the security desk, and through the lobby and up to the 3rd floor, and stood for a moment at the window, where she had stood yesterday morning telling Ethan Carter that he was dismissed. The city was clean and bright, and still below her. She thought of his voice in the truck, even and without grievance, saying, "The road was dark, the temperature was going to keep dropping, I couldn't unknow that." She turned from the window and called David into her office and told him to schedule a company-wide meeting for the following week. It took her 3 days to write what she wanted to say. She wrote and deleted and rewrote, not because she was trying to construct something that sounded good. She had written speeches that sounded good for 15 years, but because she was trying to say something true, which was a different kind of difficulty. She thought about the difference between a statement and an admission, and she decided she needed the latter. When the morning of the meeting arrived, she stood at the front of the Mercer Industries conference hall and looked out at 212 employees, all of whom had been required to attend, and most of whom had arranged their faces into the careful, neutral expressions that people wear in rooms where the CEO is about to speak. She recognized the expressions. She had trained them to make those faces. She began to speak. She told them what had happened on the road, simply and without embellishment. She told them what Ethan Carter had done. She told them, standing at a microphone in a room full of people who were pretending not to be surprised, that she had been operating under a fundamental misunderstanding, that she had confused fear with respect, compliance with commitment, policy with leadership. She said, "I fired a man last week who ran 6 blocks in a snowstorm to get to work because he had a daughter who needed to be dropped somewhere safe first. I fired him because the clock said 8:10 instead of 800, and that evening, on a mountain road in the dark, that same man stopped his truck for me when I had no way to call for help. He did not have to do that. He did it anyway, and I want you to understand that what he demonstrated in that moment is not something I built. It was something he brought here himself, despite the environment I created." She paused. "I am sorry. I am sorry to Ethan specifically, and I am sorry to everyone in this room who has been afraid to be human at work, because I made them afraid." The room was silent in a way that was entirely different from the usual corporate silence. This was not the silence of withheld opinions. This was the silence of people absorbing something unexpected. Victoria looked out at 212 faces and saw something she had not seen in years. Not deference, not careful neutrality, but something more fragile and more real. She saw people deciding whether to believe her. She understood that she had not yet earned the answer she hoped for, and that earning it would take considerably longer than a single speech. She was prepared for that. For the first time in her professional life, she was not asking for results by end of quarter. She was asking for something that did not have a deadline. Ethan was not in the room that day, but he had called Victoria 2 days earlier and told her that he would come back on one condition. And the condition was not about salary or title. The condition was that she institute a genuine review process for terminations, with a mandatory 48-hour waiting period and a required second opinion. He had written it out in a single paragraph, clearly and precisely, the way an engineer sets down a requirement. Victoria had read it twice, then called HR, and told them to draft it into policy by end of week. When she told Ethan it was done, he had been quiet for a moment, and then said, "Okay, I'll come back." He started the following Monday. His desk was in the same place it had always been. Marcus shook his hand for longer than was strictly necessary. Someone had put a small potted succulent on his desk. Nobody admitted to this, but everyone suspected Jennifer from the front desk, who had cried quietly in the bathroom the day Ethan left and had been waiting 7 days for this moment. Ethan set down his laptop bag, sat in his chair, and looked around the engineering floor for a moment at the familiar arrangement of monitors and whiteboards. at the people who were very deliberately pretending not to watch him settle back in, and he thought about all the mornings he had come to this desk and done good work, and expected nothing more complicated than the chance to keep doing it. He opened his laptop. He started his day. It was, in every outward respect, an ordinary Monday morning. But the room felt different. Not dramatically. Not in a way that could be pointed to or measured. Just lighter, as though something that had been compressing the air had been removed, and people were, for the first time in longer than they could name, breathing at full capacity. The changes did not happen overnight, because real changes never do, and Victoria knew this better than most. But they began. The performance review system was overhauled to include context, not excuses, but context, the acknowledgement that people's lives exist in 3 dimensions, and that what happens before someone walks through the door is not separate from their capacity to do good work inside it. The attendance policy was revised to distinguish between patterns and isolated incidents. A single late arrival in 3 years of consistent performance was not a pattern. It was a morning. A new channel was created for employees to raise concerns without attribution, and Victoria personally responded to the first 12 submissions herself, which was not what anyone expected, and which produced, in the week following, a 30% increase in submissions, because people had learned something they had not believed before, that the channel was real, and that something would happen when they used it. Some employees remained skeptical. That was reasonable. Trust, she had decided, was a project with a long timeline and no shortcuts. She approached it the way she approached any project, with clear metrics, consistent follow-through, and a willingness to be evaluated on results. She hired a leadership coach for the first time in her career. A woman who had spent 30 years studying organizational psychology and who told Victoria, in their second session, with complete equanimity, that she had built her company on a compliance model, and that compliance was the opposite of engagement, and that the most effective organizations in the world ran on the latter. Victoria had found this mildly infuriating and entirely accurate. She spent 6 months in those sessions dismantling assumptions she had held so long they felt like facts, and building something more considered in their place. She did not become soft. She did not become less demanding. What she became was more precise, better at distinguishing between the things that required non-negotiable standards and the things that required judgment, and better at letting human beings be human, without treating their humanity as a liability. It was harder than running on rules. Rules were clean. Judgment was complicated and exhausting, and got it wrong sometimes. She decided it was worth it. In one of those sessions, the coach asked her a question that stayed with her long after the hour was over. What is the difference between a standard that protects performance and a standard that protects you from having to feel anything? Victoria had sat with that question in the way she had learned to sit with things, not rushing to answer it, not filing it away, just holding it until it told her what it meant. The answer, when it came, was quieter and more uncomfortable than any spreadsheet result she had ever reviewed. Standards that protected performance were about the work. Standards that protected her from feeling were about her. And somewhere along the way, she had been running the two together as if they were the same thing, and calling the whole enterprise discipline. She brought this realization to the office, not as a confession but as a correction, the way you correct the calibration of an instrument when you discover it has been reading slightly off for years. The instrument was still useful. The readings were still important. They just needed to be honest. Ethan, for his part, became something the company had not had before. A senior engineer, who was also an informal advocate for the people around him. Not formally, not with a title, he wasn't interested in that. But he was the person newer employees found their way to when something felt wrong. The one who would sit with them in the break room and listen in the unhurried way he had, without agenda, until the real problem surfaced under the stated one. He was the person who taught Marcus how to push back on a deadline without making it a confrontation. And the person who told a new hire named Sophie, who had been staying until 8 p.m. every night trying to prove herself invisible, that presence didn't require obliteration, and that going home at a reasonable hour was not a performance issue but a sustainability choice. He said it simply, without drama, and she went home. He was the person who would bring a concern to Victoria's attention with enough specificity and evidence that she could actually do something about it, not as a complaint, but as a problem statement with a proposed solution attached, because that was how Ethan had always worked. Victoria, who had once run her company on the principle that problems moved upward through proper channels, and that informal influence was a form of insubordination, had come to understand that what Ethan was doing was precisely the kind of lateral intelligence that healthy organizations depend on. She didn't formalize it. She didn't give it a name. She simply made sure the door between his floor and hers was always one conversation away. They had developed, in the months after the mountain road, a working relationship that was nothing like the one they might have had if none of it had happened more honest, more direct, built on the unusual foundation of having seen each other at their worst and their most vulnerable on the same November day. He did not resent her. She did not pretend the morning hadn't happened. They had reached, without ever formally discussing it, an understanding that moved forward rather than circling back. One evening, in late winter, several months after everything, Victoria stood at the window of her office as the last light of the day was fading over the city. It was snowing again, a light snow, nothing like February. Just the quiet dusting that sometimes came in March and was gone by morning. She watched the flakes come down through the glow of the streetlights, and she thought about that mountain road, about the darkness and the stopped engine, and the particular quality of cold that had entered her car and stayed. She thought about how long she had sat there before headlights appeared, and what she had believed in that first moment of recognition. She thought about the 48 hours that had elapsed between that recognition and her ability to say, out loud and without qualification, that she had been wrong. She thought about how foreign those words had felt forming in her mouth, not because she was too proud to say them, she had always believed, but because she had actually convinced herself, somehow, across years of evidence to the contrary, that she had not been wrong. That was the part that kept returning to her in quiet moments. Not that she had made a mistake, but that she had built an entire architecture of reasoning around it, so that it never looked like one. She thought about all the ways it could have gone differently, all the moments in which a different version of Ethan Carter, a man with a smaller spirit and a more ordinary score to settle, might have kept his hands on the wheel and driven past. The snow touched the glass and dissolved. Victoria watched it and thought about the distance between the person she had been a year ago, standing at this same window, dismissing a man she hadn't taken 5 minutes to understand, and the person she was now, who still demanded excellence, and still ran a tight ship, but who had learned, finally, to distinguish between the things that make a company strong and the things that make it human, and to understand that you needed both, and that the second was not a concession to the first but its foundation. There is a kind of leadership that runs on fear, and it works for a while. And in one direction, it drives compliance, and compliance moves numbers, and numbers satisfy boards, and boards fund futures, and for years it is possible to look at the results and conclude that the method is sound. Victoria Hayes had looked at those results for 15 years. What she had not looked at was the cost, because the cost was paid by other people and didn't appear on any ledger she kept. It took a dead engine on a dark road, and a man who was under no obligation to be decent, to show her the entry she'd been missing. The lesson was not that rules don't matter, rules mattered, and she still believed that. And she still held the company to standards that made other CEOs uncomfortable. The lesson was that rules applied without wisdom are not leadership. They are administration with a closed door. And the difference between those two things is exactly the difference between an organization people survive and an organization people build something in. Ethan Carter had been building something at Mercer for 7 years. Quietly, in the space between the rules in the conversations he had at desks that weren't his, in the problems he stayed late to solve, in the 6 blocks he ran on a February morning with his coat open in the snow. A great leader is not someone who never shows mercy. A great leader is someone who knows the difference between the moment that calls for an iron standard and the moment that calls for the understanding that people are not machines, that lives have weight, that a 10-minute window in a snowstorm contains a 7-year-old girl and a widowed father and 6 blocks run in bad shoes, and all the invisible labor of a person trying, against accumulating difficulty, to be present. Ethan Carter knew this already. He had known it the way people know the things they have been forced to learn, and on a mountain road in the February dark, he had given that knowledge to someone who needed it freely, without condition, the way the best things are always given.